Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining Artsy's latest webinar, How to Buy Art Online with Confidence. So this hour, we're going to discuss and highlight best practices when buying art online. We're very lucky to be joined by 3 art world experts who will each share their unique insights. We will have some time at the end to answer questions that you submitted in advance, and please feel free to continue submitting throughout the webinar. So diving into introductions, my name is Liz Luna. I'm the Senior Director of Auctions and Institutions at Artsy. Artsy is the largest and leading global online marketplace for fine art, connecting buyers with inventory from a global network of galleries, art fairs, auction houses, and institutions. So I joined the company about 8 years ago, and today our team brings hundreds of auctions online annually, in addition to partnering with global auction houses and nonprofit partners. On a day-to-day basis, my team works directly with both first-time buyers as well as Artsy's most active and engaged collectors. So it's our hope that after this webinar, you'll walk away with some practical tips, questions, considerations to make when buying art on Artsy, as well as hear about some of the amazing innovations that the industry is making to adapt to current circumstances. So I'm excited to be joined by our panelists. We have Courtney Kremers, who's a senior auction specialist in post-war and contemporary art at Sotheby's. Ray Waterhouse, art advisor and dealer with Fine Art Brokers and Waterhouse and Dodd. And Suzanne Sienos, owner and chief conservator at Modern Art Conservation. So I'll hand it over to the panelists now to tell you a little bit more about themselves. And Courtney, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Liz, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm actually coming up on my 9th year at Sotheby's in the post-war and contemporary art department. And as a senior specialist, I work to help consign works for upcoming auctions, both in New York, but also globally. And then once we've confirmed those artworks for sale, we go out and find buyers and we sell those artworks. And then working with closely with a number of collectors, I help them with everything from really fine-tuning their collections through sales and acquisitions, but also helping them with appraisals, with sort of collection management strategies. I joined Sotheby's in 2013 from Kim Hairston Art Advisory, where I was for 2 years, prior to which I was working for the McGraby family collection, and that was right out of college. I introduced the contemporary curated concept at Sotheby's that year in 2013. And it's gone on to be an incredible success. We've collaborated with some of the most amazing collectors out there, from people like Jason Rubel, Pamela Joyner, Agnes Gund, but also tastemakers and visionaries like Swiss Beats and Oprah. So it's been a really exciting journey the last 9 years, and it continues. It gets crazier every day, every week, I feel like.
Thanks, Courtney. Ray, do you want to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Ray Waterhouse. Thank you, Liz. It's good to be here. I'm the founder and co-owner of Waterhouse and Dodd, which has private galleries in London and New York, where I live. I'm also owner of Fine Art Brokers, which has 8 experts in London, New York, and Paris. I'll be speaking today mainly as an advisor. But I'll be using a lot of my experience before COVID, because most of the work I've done as an advisor has been helping clients buy art that they haven't been able to see themselves. So most of the advice I give is in the $20,000 to $200,000 range, but I've done many deals without the clients seeing the work at over $1 million and 3 at over 20 million. Obviously, I'll also be using my experience as a dealer, because with Jonathan Dodd and myself, we sold and bought over 5,000 works of art. So I hope I can relate to some of your concerns. I've been a buyer myself and a seller online many, many times. And I think there's a viewer today, Todd, who bought something from me online in 2001. So my experience goes way back. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks. Suzanne.
Hi, yes, so thank you for having me. And I'm Suzanne Sienos, the Chief Conservator and founder of Modern Art Conservation. We are a private studio located in New York, and we work on modern and contemporary paintings and mixed media works. And I've been in conservation for about 30 years and trained at the Institute of Fine Arts and worked at MoMA for over a decade in the conservation department, and then started the practice in 2007. And now we're a staff of 12, including conservators and a support staff of technicians and registrar and photographer. And everyone has a really strong interest in modern and contemporary art. And we work with clients worldwide. Even though we're located in New York, we can work all over the world, helping museums, auction houses, advisors, artists, gallerists, and private collectors and corporate collectors with all different services. We do treatment, and we do a lot of condition reports that are usually involved in the sale process, which I'll talk more about today.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. So let's dive into our conversation. I want to start with a question for all of you. Looking back since the start of the pandemic, what aspects of your day-to-day roles within the art world would you say have changed the most? Ray, do you want to start?
Yes, so obviously, I've had almost no travel since COVID started. I've made one trip to a client, which resulted in 14-day quarantine after I came back. I visited my first auction last week at Sotheby's and my second this week at Christie's. But in many ways, my life hasn't changed so much in my life as an advisor, because the slide you're seeing now shows a Nolan, which was part of a collection I was advising on. And we consigned the collection to Sotheby's entirely by phone calls and Zoom conferences. So there was no physical inspection at all by me or Sotheby's before the consignment was agreed. So I help mainly clients who have the desire and means to buy art, but not the time and the expertise. So I've been using, in a way, the last 25 years has been preparation for what's happening now. For instance, I bought a Matisse for a client in London in 2001, I think, which he hadn't seen. He was a New York resident. And then I advised him to sell it at auction again 6 years later, and he made a very good profit. And another example, I helped a client buy a Kapoor. He was a Louisiana resident. He wanted a Kapoor. I sourced one. I found it for him. So as I say, what I do now, I've been doing for 25 years. So the new online experience is here to stay. Many people are fed up with online fairs, but we will have to get used to them as the new norm. Finally, when I first started, auction catalogs were in black and white. They appealed only to dealers. There were no fairs and no internet. People bought from their local gallery. Now, as collectors, the whole world is your gallery. So as an advisor, before and now, I help clients analyze and negotiate the millions of artworks available. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Courtney. What about you? What's your experience been?
Really, to echo what Ray said, my day-to-day has changed a lot, because it used to involve a lot of travel, a lot of being in the air and being on the road. It was traveling to see artworks in person for appraisals, or looking at them for possible sale, for consignment. As Ray talked about with the Nolan consignment, in that case, we would have flown to California, probably Ray and I, to meet with the family, to talk about their collection, to present our proposal for sale. So, all of that's really gone away. I used to joke with my husband that Delta was my favorite office, because it was free coffee and Wi-Fi and like no one bothering me for 4 hours at a time. As specialists, we're constantly also flying around to the different art fairs. Was more of a fact-finding mission for us, which is a really important part of our job. And all of that's quieted down, and it's become a lot more simple. It's really just about the objects. There's none of the the fanfare with auction season. It was really a 2-week period where we were hosting dinners and cocktails and panel discussions, which, you know, those things are a lot of fun, but they do take up a lot of time and energy. And I'm finding actually that I'm speaking probably more with the collectors that I work with than I did even before COVID, but it's a different type of communication, right? So instead of in person, it's, you know, me with my earbuds in, walking around the neighborhood, pushing my screaming 1-year-old. I think the neighborhood like got to know me super well. We were at East on Long Island. So it's different. It's simpler, but, you know, in some ways I prefer it. And, you know, we'll see. I don't know what will stay from this new life and what we'll go back to, but very, very different than pre-COVID.
Suzanne.
So for conservators who normally examine works very closely in person, this has been obviously like a huge change. And, you know, sales have been contingent upon a condition report. So when I was home, I was getting all these calls about, you know, can you go look? And I wasn't really prepared to do that. And a lot of places weren't really open to do that. So we had to come up with a way to do examinations, and we devised a remote system, which you can see we provide a cheat sheet to a representative who would be on site. So that could be an auction specialist, a gallery assistant, an art handler, and usually that person would be alone with the art, and we would guide that person, and we still do guide people through the examination, so they become our eyes. So with digital photography and video conferencing, we were able to get information, and we can still do this now, get information and create a report, which has some, you know, limitations, obviously. The person's not trained the way we are, but it's the best we've been able to do in a lot of cases. And then things have partially opened up. So as soon as auctions really got underway, in those 2 weeks that Courtney or someone at Auction House would be there, we started to go in with a lot of safety precautions. And in those cases, what's been interesting is we've sometimes been, for the buyer, the only other eyes set on the work and the only neutral eyes in some way set upon the work. And that's added this new role and responsibility for the conservator to describe the work to someone who is not seeing it in person. And, you know, obviously we have a lot of clients we know, and we know their tolerance for condition and their taste, but we haven't been as integral in that way, and that's becoming a new part of our job.
Great, yes, thank you for that context. And we'll definitely circle back to this macro climate that we're all living in later in our conversation, but diving into the meat of the discussion on buying art online, the first step in this process is finding that work that you can't live without. Ray, if you put on your advisor hat, I would imagine that many of your clients do have a very clear sense of what they like, what they're looking for. But I'm also curious how you get to that stage. And for a newer collector, if you can give us some recommendations around finding artists or specific works.
Thank you, Liz. Well, that's a huge question. And in fact, even experienced major collectors need help sourcing and advising on the condition. So for newer collectors, I think the advice is to look and learn. Normally that would be going to art fairs, auctions and exhibitions, but now it's checking out online, such as Artsy. Go to gallery websites, look at art fairs online. And Artsy, I know, has tools to help you refine your search by subject and style. And by the way, for a new collector, it's fine not to know what you like. You know, don't be embarrassed. I remember a collector of mine, when he started, he said, Ray, I don't know what I like. I don't even know what I should like. And he ended up collecting art that was related to some of the homes he has. For example, this was a Maximilian Loos post-impressionist work we bought for him because he has a house near Saint-Tropez. The Degas I went to Japan for on behalf of the client. I had to check out the condition authenticity in Tokyo. He liked Degas because when he was at college, he had a Degas poster on his wall. And Oldenburg I bought for a client who'd been to a big exhibition many years before. So rather than just buy randomly, try and find something that you have a connection to. So I would say buying art should be done carefully, but it should also be enjoyable. And challenge yourself. Don't just buy paintings of pretty blossom. Buy challenging subjects and in a style that's relevant to when it was painted. So don't buy a Cubist picture that was 50 years after Picasso started, or an Impressionist 50 years after Monet. And finally, I recommend buying fewer but better work. So let's say you have a budget of 20,000. Try buying one good piece for 15 and maybe prints for the other 2 places that you have. Or if your budget's higher, be careful and buy something really good, and take your time filling the spaces. Thank you.
Great advice. Courtney, what about you?
So I think the most important step when you start collecting is to spend a lot of time looking, learning, discovering. And, as Ray was talking about, this process used to be an IRL and in real life process. So it was, going to the art fairs, it was walking through the museums, going gallery hopping on the weekends, coming to see our auction previews. And a lot of that has gone away. I mean, Sotheby's is still open by appointment for our auction previews, but and galleries are open by appointment, but it's definitely a more daunting process. And since we aren't traveling around as much, if you're lucky to live in New York and you have the museums and the galleries, that's great, but a lot of people don't even have those. So the process has really moved online. And I think it's actually amazing what, a platform like Artsy, but also the different gallery platforms, how they've built these out to help new collectors in this discovery process. And in some ways, I'm actually finding the last couple of months, because I collect on a very low level, emerging artists, I'm learning more about the artists that I'm interested in than maybe I even used to. Because I think we've all been there where we found ourselves walking through an art fair, and after you've been there an hour and a half and you're 10 rows deep into the fair, everything can sort of start to blur together. And it can be, especially for young collectors, I think, really intimidating to stop and ask the gallery director who's in the booth a question about an artist. They tend to be surrounded by other people patiently waiting in line. But now online, it's you start clicking through, and I think always the first step is a gallery that you respect and a program that you like. And then that takes you deeper into the other artists that the gallery may show. And so you find someone that you respond to visually at first, is usually the case. And then you start reading. And these platforms now, it's like there will be a video with the artist in their studio. There's an expert talking about that particular work or the artist's practice. And before you know it, with that one artwork, you kind of know the artist's whole life story and what their practice is really about. And I actually think it's been really enriching in some ways. And I've had similar feedback from collectors. So knowing that this is now sort of the new way for the time being, Sotheby's is trying to respond to that. And so we've really been building out our own platform to fit these needs. So like Amy Capolazzo did an amazing video on a Barclay Hendricks that we sold last week. We've built out something that we started a couple years ago called Anatomy of an Artwork, but I love this series where we really dive deep into one object and all the different kind of components of the subject and how it was made. We did a really cool video recently on a Peter Bruegel that we have for private sale. And then within sort of the information about each object that we might be selling at auction, usually with a traditional print catalog, we're really stuck with a page count. So even for, the top lots of the sale, we might have 6 pages max. For most artworks, we'd have 1 page, and there's only so much information that you can fit on 1 page. But online, really, the possibilities are endless. So we sold a Richter yesterday in Hong Kong, amazing painting for 27 million. And we had an amazing sort of, you scroll down like a map where you could really see where all the comparable paintings were around the world. And again, the sky's the limit when it comes to what we can do online. And it's such an incredible tool that we all have for discovering new artists.
Absolutely. Content and storytelling is key. So as a collector, let's say I found something that I love online. What is the next step before I hit the bid button, before I reach out to the gallery? Ray, can you walk us through sort of your suggested next steps?
Thank you. So there's, for me, the main aspect to establish when buying art online is trust. You're not buying groceries or shoes. And there are four main areas that I think need to be fulfilled. Number one, do you trust the seller? Is what he or she says accurate? Can you believe him about the condition and the value of the artist? Number two, is the artwork authentic? Three, is it worth what's being asked? After all, a painting might only cost $200 or $300 to make, but it could be worth 5,000 or 500,000 or 5 million. And lastly, when you pay for it, will the art be sent to you securely and safely? So number one, about trusting the person selling it to you, I advise to engage with the seller, whether it's an auctioneer or a dealer. We all love being asked valuable questions. Start a dialogue. Is the frame good? How's the condition? What's the provenance? What are your thoughts about it? So find out if the dealer is part of an association, if he or she exhibits at good fairs. Ask about the guarantee policy, about tax for where it's going to come, wherever you live, if there's a discount. So all these help you establish trust. And I know Artsy has you can tell us something, Liz, in a second about the aspects. You can see how it might look on your wall. The second and third questions I mentioned about authenticity and condition, we can talk about later. But it's worth saying now that ask for good images, lots of different images, the front, the back, the side, and check out the size, because, you know, even as somebody who's been in the business a long time, often I see a painting and it's actually smaller or bigger than I imagined, even though I know the size. And finally, do ask advisors. We can be less expensive and more valuable than you might think. So you would never consider buying a house or an apartment without consulting a lawyer or surveyor. We can add a lot of inside information that can be helpful before you take the plunge.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. I think two things I want to chime in on. First, around trust and safety. That's so important, something that Artsy takes very seriously. All of our partners are vetted, because within a marketplace context, both on the buyer side, but also on the seller side, having that trust is super important. So thanks for bringing that up, Ray. And I think you were also alluding to our augmented reality tool in our app that will allow you to place a work from Artsy into your space. So exactly to your point, Ray, sometimes when you see it in person, it's bigger or smaller than you anticipated, even though you did read those dimensions, and this tool is very helpful in actually checking your expectations. Courtney, I know you have a number of things that you always think through yourself and also recommend that buyers, you know, walk through. What are those questions buyers should ask?
Yeah, so Liz, as you were saying, like, there's really no such thing as a first step, because the first step is many steps. It's really building a dossier and answering a bunch of questions, sort of working through a checklist. With that said, every artist really has its own, and every object has its own set of questions and checklist. And part of developing your expertise is understanding even what questions to ask. And that, to Ray's point, is where an art advisor or an auction house specialist can really help you to figure out where to begin and what those questions are. A really easy way to break it down is the familiar five: the who, what, when, where, why. The who is pretty obvious. Who is the artist? Are they emerging? Are they mid-career? Are they blue chip? Have they passed away? What museums collect this artist's work? Are there collectors of note that collect the artist? And how is the market for that artist overall? The what is the artwork? What is the medium? Is this a work on paper? Is it a painting, a photograph? Is this a typical medium for the artist? Are there things that you should understand about that object? I kind of ask for condition as part of the what. When was this painted? When was it photographed? How does that year fit into the artist's overall career? Where has the object been? So what is the provenance? Who's owned it before you have, if this is something on the secondary market? Where else has it been? What exhibitions? Are those exhibitions published in books? Is there literature on this? And then, of course, the big question for everyone, which is why? So why are you interested? How does this fit into other works you have? What does it say maybe about you, about what you're looking for? And what kind of dialogue does it establish, again, within your collection? And also, to reemphasize what Ray said, asking for so many pictures, especially in this new world. One high-res image is not enough. I actually prefer not a high-res image. I like a picture like on an A-frame leaning against a wall with a coffee cup and a dog and a plant or something in it, because you really want to see what this object, or get a sense of it in real life. It's really hard to tell from one image that gives you no context. And then, of course, pictures of the reverse, which are really helpful in figuring out some of those questions, the when, the where. Often there will be labels on the back that might be an exhibition label or the gallery label that describes the medium. So the photos alone can really help you answer a lot of these questions.
Super helpful. So two themes that I think we just touched on that I want to dig into a little bit more: condition and authenticity. These are often words that we sometimes fuse together. I've heard them used sort of inaccurately as if they're interchangeable, which they are not, right? So I want to unpack what these are. And Suzanne, perfect time to bring you in. So when you're brought in to evaluate condition, what is your role, and can you talk through your process and what a client can expect?
Sure. So as I said earlier, condition has become an integral part of the sale process, especially for higher priced works. And we consult on the technical quality and the technical history of an artwork. So my team and I are brought in often by the buyer or by the seller or by both sometimes. It's a very small profession, so there are not a lot of conservators. And we're found generally by word of mouth. So if you're looking for a conservator, you might contact another collector, someone who's been collecting for a while, contact a museum conservation department, talk to your art advisor if you have one. And then you want someone who has a specialization in what you are looking to buy. So if you're buying works on paper, you want a paper conservator. If you're buying modern, you want a conservator who specializes in modern contemporary. If you're buying an old master painting, an old master. So you want to do a little homework to find a conservator. And if you know a conservator, that person can refer you to the right person for what you're buying at that moment. And you really do want someone who's versed in the market so that they understand confidentiality, as well as how that work you're buying might compare to others that are in the market at the same time or have recently sold. So they can kind of give you an idea of what's out there and how this work might fit into that. So we're brought in to do an exam, and that exam could be a verbal or a written report. And often if it's right before a sale, it's just a verbal. We're just on the phone with the person, or right actually in the auction house sometimes, or with them looking, but we'll do a written report much of the time. And there's no standard format for a written report by a conservator, so you'll see a variety of things, but there is a difference between a shipper's report or a museum loan report, where they'll just mark up an image and document conditions they see. A conservator's report will actually describe those conditions and provide some context for those conditions. So in the report, you'll see how we looked at it. What was the lighting? What lights did we bring? Did we use ultraviolet light or magnification? as Courtney just mentioned, we'll look at the reverse and we'll look on the backing, on the frame, on the reverse of the stretcher or the canvas, and look for labels and inscriptions and note those, and that helps with the provenance. And then we'll describe how the work was made, all the materials and techniques that the artist used, and then look for conditions. And you know, we're noting things like dust, cracks, previous restoration, in painting, things we can see with ultraviolet light, things we can see with our own eyes very close up with high magnification. And then we'll give an overall assessment. Not every Conservators report will give one, but we do that. We will say, is it excellent, good, very good, poor, stable, not stable? And sometimes we'll give recommendations at that moment of what maybe could be done to improve the condition if there are issues. And then the report is often shared by this. If we were hired by the seller, the report sometimes is shared with potential buyers. So we get permission to talk to people about the report we've written. We can't just get a call and say, hi, I see your report, tell me. So it's always very important that your conservator respect who hired them. And then we talk about the report and the considerations and questions that might come up, which might be, how healthy is this artwork? And are there condition issues that I need to think about? Are they structural issues or are they aesthetic issues? Is there just dust on the surface or is the paint flaking? Is there old restoration and was that warranted? Is it good? How does that impact the art? If it's a work made of unusual materials, you know, what's the likelihood that those materials will change, and is that the artist's intent, and are you okay living with those changes? And then there are installation questions like, can I hang my Jasper Johns and caustic painting above my fireplace? Or if I buy something that's very large, it might fit on my wall, but it may not fit through the door or up in the elevator. And then what happens? Do you have to roll that painting? And is it safe to roll that painting? So there are a lot of questions that come up. You know, how do you frame something? What's the safest way I can live with it or ship it? And what's the routine maintenance that this artwork might require? Because it's bigger than just buying it at that moment. It's actually taking care of it as you go on. And everything that we talk about is our opinion, and it's not an authentication document. And so I'm going to leave that to Courtney.
A perfect segue to bring Courtney in as a specialist. How do you think about authentication and authenticity, particularly within the auction house setting?
So there's a common misperception that auction houses authenticate artworks. We do not do that. We do not authenticate. When we offer something in our auction, we offer it under our terms of guarantee. So that means that for a 5-year period, if there's new information that comes to light, essentially stating or showing that something that we sold isn't by the artist that we said it was, we would refund that sale in full. So this is actually a really important part of our job, because otherwise that could get really expensive if we didn't do our research and we were constantly refunding people for artworks that they were not actually, they weren't what they said they were. So it's complicated because basically with every artist, there's a different procedure for authentication. And with some, it's fairly straightforward. And with others, we're basically, there's nothing. And so it comes down to like good old detective work. So the easiest situation is when an artist has a catalog raisonné. So that's someone like Jackson Pollock, Jean Dubuffet, Richard Diebenkorn. These artists all have published catalog raisonnés. We always say cat res for short. Essentially, a catalog raisonné is a book that's a compilation of all the artists' known works that they have ever made. So if somebody sends us something that isn't in that catalog raisonné, 99% of the time, we wouldn't offer that work in our sale under our terms of guarantee. It's great because now a lot of these cat reses are moving online. These catalogs can be super expensive, like thousands of dollars for the Warhol cat res, the Pollock cat res. Morris Lewis has an online catalog raisonné. Roy Lichtenstein has a great online cat res, which we have a bottom right image of here that's called the image duplicator. So those are the most kind of straightforward situations. Then you have artists where there's an authentication committee that's still in place, that's still reviewing artworks and issuing some form of a certificate or a number. Alexander Calder or Alberto Giacometti are two really good examples of that. So for Calder works, every single sale, every time we offer a work at auction, we have to send that work down to the foundation to be seen in New York. And this is even if we've sold that particular sculpture 4 times before, every single time we send it down. And when we send it down, we also send it with a full form that has to be completed by the seller, detailing what the object is, where they bought it, anything that they know about it. And on sort of one day, and this usually happens once a month, once every 2 months, the Calder Foundation gets together, they review everything. They often actually provide a lot of additional research for us. And then if all checks out, they issue it an A number, which gets published in our, well, used to be published in our catalog. Now it's published online. So you should always, when you're buying a Calder, you have to make sure that it has an A number, for example. And at Sotheby's, we do that. We walk you through that whole process, basically, or we take over that process for you. Then there's situations where there used to be authenticating committees, and there are no longer. So good examples are Jean-Michel Basquiat, Keith Haring, both actually disbanded those committees in 2012. And that's usually a result of just the mounting costs of litigation from people that didn't like the findings of the committee. So in 2012, Haring and Basquiat stopped issuing certificates. So sometimes a work comes with a certificate and sometimes it may not. And a really good high profile example of a work that did not have a certificate but checked out when it came to the next steps of research was the amazing Basquiat head that we sold in 2017 for $110 million, which I have pictured here. So this is a work that didn't have a certificate, but it had sold at auction in 1984 during the artist's lifetime, and it had stayed in one collection ever since. It was also published in an important monograph by Richard Marshall. So we had no questions about it, no doubts, and clearly the market didn't either. And then you have artists like de Kooning, Franz Klein, where there are no catalog raisonnés, there are no certificates out there, there are no really experts, there's nothing. So that's when it comes down to research and us really getting comfortable with the provenance, with the exhibition history. And ideally, we then have something from the artist's lifetime. So that's a photograph of the work in an exhibition during the artist's lifetime, or possibly illustrated in a press clipping. We sold this de Kooning from 1975 last year. And it was featured in actually a Vogue magazine from 1978, an interview between Thomas Hess and the artist. And so it was illustrated in that 1978 Vogue, and that for us checked the box. When you're looking at, of course, emerging artists from galleries, you're not, they're not issuing certificates. It's for you then really to kind of hold on to your invoice. I keep a digital copy. I keep a hard file of any invoices for things that I've purchased. I keep the correspondence between myself and the director, whoever sold me the work, because you never know. One day there might be an auction specialist who's digging around looking for information on that object. And all of those pieces of information are really important. So, but yeah, it's a bit of a minefield. It can be, and that's why, again, it can be really valuable to have an advisor who's walking you through the different sort of processes for each artist, or talking to your local auction house specialist.
So Ray, then from the gallery perspective or dealer perspective, can you also speak to authenticity?
Yeah, thank you. Courtney's given a very good and complete answer with regard to post-war artists. When buying from a dealer, in theory, the invoice carries a guarantee. I mean, in France, the guarantee lasts for 30 years. Sotheby's and Christie's, their guarantee is for 5 years. New research does come up from time to time. For a living artist, in terms of what Courtney said, you need to get a full invoice. Ask the gallery for every detail, the size, the date, the title, list it all. And when it's a photo or a print, get the edition number. For the secondary market, this is an example of a Kusama registration. So it's her own certificate. This is what you need if you're buying Kusama. You should not buy one without it. For earlier works, for instance, Leger, we sold this Leger this week. You need a certificate from the expert. There are many so-called experts around the world who sign documents which have no validity. Courtney mentioned the Calder Foundation. The Chagall Committee in Paris has a different way of working. You need to send the original Chagall to Paris, and if they think it's not correct, they destroy the work. So if you have a work in your home which you think is by Chagall, you're not sure, you actually have to take the risk of never getting it back. I just want to add one little thing to the conservation that Suzanne mentioned. When you're considering an important work, you might need to get an independent conservator. It could be Suzanne or somebody else. Auction houses use often one conservation person to do reports on 300 pieces in a sale, which can be perfunctory. So if you're buying something important from a gallery or an auction, consider employing your own conservator to have an independent report.
And great transition to bring Suzanne back in. I know you've worked with Courtney before, for example. When you are brought in, how are you able to put condition into perspective for the buyer or the seller?
Yeah, so we have worked together on many auction seasons, and we do contextualize conditions. So a list of conditions that a potential buyer might read could be kind of scary. So if those conditions are put into context or perspective, sometimes it can make someone more comfortable and understand where condition fits and what you should worry about and maybe what you shouldn't be so worried about. So there are differences. There are damages to an artwork that come from neglect or an accident or a poor environment. And then there are inherent conditions that are from age or from process. So there are certain expected conditions for certain artists and certain media, such as, stress cracks on an old oil painting, or things that are from process, like cracks on the edges of a silkscreen painting by Warhol that was stretched in the factory, with not so much care, or cracks on like a Riopel or a Joan Mitchell in the impasto. So there are things that are process related, things that are damages. And good conservators will have a level of experience that lets them put these conditions into perspective and explain, what might need attention, but might be typical for that artist's work, or what might be typical and should be left alone, like a footprint or a shoe print on a Basquiat, or the wrinkled paint on a de Kooning or a Pollock, or oil staining on early Frankenthalers or other stains on stain paintings from the medium that the artists used. So these are not necessarily condition problems, but they're just conditions that you might notice that you should be aware of and how they fit for that artist. And then similarly, if you're collecting unusual materials, paintings or other artworks with unusual materials, you want to know, what is the artist's intent, what's damage, what is acceptable change, and how to take care of these works made of materials like soap or gum or urine on metallic paint or butterfly wings. They come with a whole host of caretaking needs. The conservator can help you with like understanding the history of the painting, the technical history, the nuances, and what improvements might be able to happen through treatment, which we also do. But it's also good for us to know the threshold that you might have for a condition or why you're buying something. Are you buying it because you love it? Are you buying it for a long-term investment? Are you buying it to quickly resell. You know, we're not only working for collectors, we're working sometimes for dealers who might want to buy something and sell it again. So they need to know, you know, are those conditions, how those conditions will impact this, you know, what they're getting.
Super helpful. So along with condition and authenticity, another extremely important factor that collectors weigh when deciding to make a purchase is the price. So often people ask, how do I know if this price is fair? Where did this price come from? Courtney, as a specialist, part of your role is pricing, setting the low-high estimates that we see next to an auction lot. So can you quickly walk us through what goes into that process?
Okay, I'll try and do this quickly because it's not actually a quick process at all. Setting an estimate at auction is really an art form. We actually meet as a specialist team twice a week on Mondays and Wednesdays. There'll be about 15 of us that look at the group of works that are potential for consignment or just appraisals we're working on, and we all discuss these values as a group because there is no exact right value. It's a potential range of values. And really to get there is a triangulation using a number of different variables. So on the secondary market at auction, we generally have the benefit of auction comparables, and I say comps for short. So auction comparables are aggregated on a site like ArtNet. Sotheby's has a subscription to, but I highly recommend if you're collecting that you get a subscription to one of these sites. So we use auction comparables. We use private sale prices. So that's before when I was talking about walking to art fairs and how that's kind of a fact-finding mission for us. That's important because we start to hear, you know, what sold and for how much. And this sort of goes into our memory database, and we use that for pricing in the future. Of course, we think about the market, the current market for the artist, but also just more broadly economically. And then, of course, the seller, because that's often the forgotten piece. It's a dialogue between us and the seller and the auction house. With our estimates, we're generally, we're trying to put a value on a work that's on one hand, you know, acknowledges the value of the piece, but on the other is sufficiently attractive to generate interest and to bring in the maximum number of bidders on auction day. And then you often have the seller who has, you know, a higher expectation of value, and so it can become sometimes a little bit of a push-pull. So the really easy example, when we're pricing something, an artist like Warhol or Donald Judd, where they tend to work in a serial fashion, there are often many auction comparables at our disposal, and it really then comes down to nuances like the condition of that exact piece, and with Warhol in particular, the crispness of the particular screen on that canvas. So with Warhol's Jackie series, for example, there are about 260 of these single canvases made in 1964, so they come up with some frequency. So let's say we were pricing the image on the top left, we can look and see that there were 2 examples that sold within the last year and a half or so, both in the 1.1 to 1.3 range. And we would then really compare the quality of the screen of this one to those, because they're all the same size. Most of them are blue. There are some white, there are some gold. And the smiling Jackie is the most commercial of the 8 different images of the First Lady taken from around the time of JFK's assassination and then republished in these press clippings. And then I threw in there the record for a Jackie, a smiling Jackie, is about 3.5 million from 2007, because oftentimes collectors will also do sellers will also do their research, and they'll say, well, why are you at 1 to 1.5 as an estimate? I saw that one sold for 3.5. And so then we have to explain that, one price doesn't make an entire market. And also 2007, of course, was a really high point in the market in general. It's usually not that easy. In the case of Kerry James Marshall's masterpiece, Pastimes, that we ended up selling in May of 2018 for $21 million on an estimate of 8 to 12. If we had just been using auction comps, we would have totally gotten it wrong, because at that time, the record price for work by the artist was $5 million. And the last time an example from this particular series, the Garden Project paintings, had come up at auction, that work had sold for just under $800,000 in 2009. But 2009 was, of course, then a very low point in the markets in general. And then a lot had happened in Kerry James Marshall's market between then and 2018, when we had just come off of the amazing mid-career survey, traveling between Chicago and LA and the Met. But also we knew that there were 2 or 3 prices in the $10 million range privately. So this wasn't, our estimate of 8 to 12 million, in other words, wasn't like out of thin air. And then finally, there are sometimes when we bring a work to market, like was the case with Matthew Wong's Realm of Appearances that we sold in June, where work had never come to market. This was an artist who had only really been painting for the last few years. This painting was from 2018. And we then decide to set our estimate more at primary gallery pricing, and then we let the market decide what something is worth. So in this case, our estimate was 60 to 80,000, and it ended up selling for 1.8 million, which we would never have predicted that before the sale. I think I was guessing like in the $700,000 range. But this record actually just got blown out of the water yesterday by a painting that Christie's sold in their day sale for $4.5 million, which is really just astonishing. Wong tragically passed away just about a year ago, but since then he's really been discovered by the international art world collectors, and he's become beloved in a very short amount of time. So it really runs the gamut from us having a lot of information on our hands to relatively little information, and then we're just kind of ultimately putting something out there for the market to decide what it's worth. Sorry, that wasn't
Thank
short.
you for that. I'm watching time. I want to make sure we still have some questions. Ray, do you quickly want to give us some thoughts with regard to primary versus secondary market, auction versus dealer purchases?
Yeah, I'll be quick. So I think when you're buying from the primary market, it's mainly the dealer who sets the price, and you have to decide, are you going to buy something that's with a big dealer who will support the artist, or will you be more speculative? So I've got a comparison between 2 similar looking works of art by artists who were born in the same year, almost the same size, and yet the prices are very different. So my advice here is what you see is not necessarily how things are priced. Dumas has made over $1 million 32 times at auction, whereas Graham Dean hasn't been supported by big galleries, and his top price is 50,000. So there's research needed, as Courtney said. With secondary market, just to repeat a few things we said before, date is so important. These 2 Warhols, same size, they look very similar, but one was painted in 1963, the great year for Warhol, and one is 14 years later. And one is of Elizabeth Taylor, and one a Middle Eastern princess who has less commercial input. So I know we're rushed for time, so a lot of research is needed. Buy with your eye as well as your ear and research.
Thanks, Ray. So moving forward, looking into the future, we talked first about how the pandemic has changed your role over the last several months, but I'm curious how you think it will continue to shape the way collectors buy into the future, the way that you do your work. So Courtney, how have auction houses shifted to make the process more self-serve online? What parts of these changes do you think will remain? Are certain things going back to normal? Are we living in a new normal? What are your thoughts?
I think we're in a new normal, it's safe to say. I think online auctions are definitely here to stay. I think year to date, we've had 255 some auctions online, and last year at this time it was 88. So we're really quickly shifting in that direction, and I don't think we will go back. Same for print versus online. We can actually do so much more in our online catalogs. And yeah, we're putting condition reports there. Sort of everything that you could possibly need, we're putting online. Print catalogs, save them, they'll be fossils one day. Those are definitely over. But I think as far as what's coming back, I think you have to seeing objects in real life, in person. There's really no comparison for that. There's no substitute. So I think on a positive note, maybe every time you're considering buying something, you won't have to jump on a plane. You'll feel a little more comfortable with talking to a conservator, talking to a specialist, talking to an advisor. But I think people will absolutely go back to seeing gallery shows, coming in to see our previews. That won't go away.
And Ray, with we've talked about fairs and exhibitions sort of largely moving online. Should that affect a buyer's strategy?
So should buying online affect the strategy?
Exactly, yes. Or how does that impact the way a buyer should?
I think there's naturally going to be more caution buying online because, as Courtney said, the physical reaction, your emotional reaction when seeing paint on canvas or the patina of a bronze sculpture can't be replaced. But I would also add a note of caution because it is very easy to buy online. And so do your research, make sure you love the piece, maybe even try and get it on approval. As a dealer, we send works out on approval. That's not possible all the time, but buying online should be fun, but do your research.
Great advice. Suzanne, any thoughts here?
Well, I just think that, buyers will probably have further reliance on a conservator's report now because we may be the only people seeing the works in person, but also they have more access to having our thoughts because people are accepting these remote exams. So I think, that's just going to open up things so that we can be in places we've never been before. Or we can't be at the same time at all the different, when fairs reopen, but also just being able to get access and help translate what something looks like to someone by providing more images and things that are not, Photoshopped to look nice or just cropped to look correct online. So we can give you a little more insight into what you might be getting.
Amazing. So it looks like we have a few short minutes for questions. I saw a number of questions coming in regarding shipping. So I wonder if that's a good topic for the panel to tackle. What questions should a buyer consider with regard to shipping, and at what point in the process, pre-purchase, post-purchase, excuse me, should you be thinking about shipping and logistics?
So,
anyone want to take that?
Speaking as a dealer and an advisor to clients buying from a dealer, you should certainly ask, is shipping included? If it's not, can it be offered in lieu of a discount? If you're buying a photograph, can it be printed locally? We just sold a photograph to a client in Berlin. Instead of printing it in New York or London, we printed it in Berlin. So first of all, she saved shipping, and secondly, she saved import tax. And that brings me on to a very big question. If you're buying a work of art and you live in a different country to where you're buying it, know how much import tax you'll be paying. If you import into Europe, it's about 6%. Into Asia, it can be 20%. And lastly, if you're buying from an auction, you need to have a recognized shipper that the auction house recognizes, but sometimes it's worth getting your own quote. Over to you, Courtney.
Yeah, I would say definitely always consider shipping before buying something, because we've had it happen where someone buys a big outdoor sculpture for $5,000 and they're all excited, and then they get the quote for shipping and installation and it's $30,000. So I mean, that's an extreme example, but you should always ask, and also think about, do you live in a post-war building in New York City on the 10th floor? And as Suzanne said earlier, like if you can't get it up the elevator or the stairwell, you might have to crane it in the window, which that's a whole insane process, especially in New York, for permitting, etc. So better to be safe than sorry. Always ask the question.
Perfect. All right, so our last question, then we'll wrap up. A lot of questions were around how you find emerging artists, what questions to ask, how to look for these types of artists. I will quickly plug the Artsy Vanguard feature, which is currently live on our site. It's an annual feature that we do that focuses on the best of what's emerging right now. So I always love to consult that myself and use that as the jumping off point for further discovery, but also curious for other thoughts from our panelists. Suzanne?
Well, I do collect at this low level, and I find that charity auctions, which are often hosted by Artsy, are a really great place to start, because you're spending your money for a good cause, and there are also a lot of fairs that are not like the main fair, but smaller fairs which have lower price works, and the dealers are really willing to have long conversations with you about what you might be interested in. So I would do those. I think they're good places to start.
Courtney, do you have any thoughts?
I know, some people have had a lot of success going to MFA showings at the end of the year, or, studio visits, whether they're in Brooklyn or in LA, but that's a lot of work. So I tend to go to the next step, which is I follow galleries who do a lot of that hunting around, and that I think have established a good program and track record of finding these emerging artists and then nurturing them to the next level. And sometimes with, great success. So a good example is Karma Gallery, and Karma Gallery, they're the ones that showed the Matthew Wong that I mentioned earlier, but I love a couple of young artists in their program and have bought pieces. Rachel Uffner Gallery is another one of my favorites. So yeah, as Suzanne said, it's kind of going to like the next tier down art fair. Swerner and Gagosian are great, but not everyone can afford those artists. So yeah, it's kind of getting to know the galleries and then their programs, and through them discovering. And I think a lot of artists can also be good introductions. So if you ask an artist, if you're lucky to have that dialogue, they often know of interesting people and what they're working on.
Great advice. That is all the time we have. So I want to thank Courtney, Ray, and Suzanne for participating in our discussion. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today. We will share a link to this recording once we've prepared that for you early next week, likely, and we'll also share information from our panelists. In the meantime, for those of you who don't yet have the Artsy app, I encourage you to download that today. We have a lot of exciting features coming, and you can already start utilizing some of the fantastic tips that the experts shared today as you're exploring works up at auction, online art fairs, gallery inventory, and viewing rooms. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.